She watched it all from her desk. The first glance, the obsession building behind cold eyes. The moment a dangerous man stopped being a boss and became something far more terrifying, a man in love. She saw the trap closing, she saw the girl walking straight into it, and every single day, she said nothing. But silence has a price. And in a world where one wrong move costs lives, the woman who watched everything from the shadows was about to learn that staying quiet is its own kind of choice. What would you have done if you saw it coming and did nothing? Welcome to our channel, where we bring you stories of mafia bosses and the unexpected love that breaks them open, tales of fierce loyalty, family bonds forged in fire, and the quiet courage of ordinary people caught in extraordinary lives. The lesson this story carries: silence is never neutral. Every choice we don't make is still a choice. If this story already has you feeling something drop a comment below telling me Team Lorenzo or Team She Should Have Run. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a story with real emotional weight, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. We post every week, and trust me, you don't want to be late.
I remember the first time I saw it, that flicker of something other than business in Mr. Vitali's eyes. It was about 6 months ago. He was walking through the lobby, and the new girl, Lily, was at the coffee station by my desk, fumbling with the espresso machine. He stopped, a thing he never does, and just watched her. He moves like a panther, that man, all quiet power, but in that moment, he was just frozen. I knew then this would be different. I'd seen assistants come and go, but none of them ever made him pause. He eventually asked about some Calabresi file, his voice like gravel, but his eyes never left her. She answered without even looking up, telling him she'd already handled a problem he didn't even know he had. That was the beginning. I should have warned her then, told her that kind of attention from him isn't a prize, it's a cage. Today, she walked past my desk looking like a movie star. Her hair was down, she was wearing perfume, I could smell the jasmine, and she had a look of pure determination on her face. A few minutes later, I heard the faint but sharp sound of a cup hitting his desk, hard. I winced. The man is a storm behind that custom suit and Roman statue face, and I've learned to read the weather patterns. His gaze can feel like a physical weight, and I could only imagine him pinning her with it from across that enormous desk. I saw her twist that little ring on her finger as she walked in, a nervous habit I'd noticed weeks ago. Lorenzo Vital misses nothing. He catalogs every tick, every tell, filing them away for later. I saw him do it with business rivals, but seeing him do it with her felt so much worse, and I just sat there, pretending to sort the mail. I couldn't hear the words, not clearly, but the tension rolled out from under his office door like a fog. His voice was a low rumble, hers was clipped and sharp. I saw him stand and start pacing, a blur of charcoal gray behind the frosted glass. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. In my 5 years here, I've learned what that quiet means. It's the calm before he brings an empire to its knees. Everyone on this floor knows what Mr. Vitali is, what he's capable of. We just don't talk about it. I saw that truth dawn on Lily about 2 months in. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. I thought for sure she'd quit. Any sane person would have run. But the next day, she came in, chin held high, and walked right back into the lion's den. I heard him through the intercom later that day, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Something changed after that. An unspoken agreement settled between them. She knew the risks and stayed anyway, and he started treating her less like an employee and more like a puzzle he was obsessed with solving. Now, watching him move around in there, a caged predator, I felt that old guilt creep back in. I could have been a friend, offered her an out. Instead, I kept my head down. I heard her say something about her personal life being none of his business, and I had to physically stop myself from shaking my head. With Lorenzo Vital, everything is his business. Their argument grew clearer as they moved closer to the door. I saw their shadows through the glass, standing so close. Even from my desk, the air felt charged. I've seen the man negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but the muffled sound of Lily's voice made his silhouette tense up. She was challenging him, and no one does that. He must have noticed her perfume, the way she did her hair. He's a man who thrives on details, and she'd just handed him a list of new ones. Then I heard the word that made my stomach drop. Date. The word echoed in the silence that followed. A date. It sounded so normal, so out of place in this world of secrets and danger. The office door finally opened, and Lily stormed out, her face flushed with anger and something else I couldn't name. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, his expression carved from ice, but his eyes were a raging storm. "His name is Tyler," she'd said, grabbing her purse from the visitor's chair next to my desk. She was trying so hard to be brave, but her hands were shaking. She rushed past me, desperate to escape, but his voice, cold and sharp, stopped her at the elevators. I couldn't make out his question, but I heard her response loud and clear, something sarcastic about what she was going to wear. The defiance was magnificent, but I knew she was poking a sleeping dragon. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my chest. This wouldn't end well. End. He watched her go, his stare fixed on the elevator doors long after they'd closed. For 6 months, I'd watched him with those beautiful, empty women who floated in and out of his life. He never looked at them the way he looked at Lily. He never looked at them like he wanted to either protect them or possess them completely. He turned back into his office, and the mask of indifference he usually wore was gone. There was just raw, unguarded fury. He said her name, Lily, so softly it was almost a whisper, but it sounded like a curse. I should have said something, anything. I should have told her that a man like Tyler might break her heart, but a man like Lorenzo would break her spirit. I just watched, silent. I knew it was a mistake the second she left. I stayed late, catching up on paperwork I'd been ignoring. He didn't leave, he just sat in his office, the lights of the city reflecting off the windows. An hour later, a courier delivered a file to me. "For Mr. Vitali, urgent." The name on the tab was Tyler's. I took it to his door and saw him staring at his phone, his face tight with a kind of agony I'd never seen on him. He just nodded for me to leave it on my desk. My hands trembled as I sat back down, that file burning a hole in my blotter. A few minutes later, his phone rang. His whole body went rigid. After a moment, I heard him say, "Don't move. I'm 5 minutes away." His voice was pure, lethal calm. He was on his feet and out the door before I could even process it, his face a mask of murder. I remember the first time I saw her. It was a Tuesday, I think, and she walked in wearing a crimson dress that silenced the room for a heartbeat. You could tell she wasn't used to that kind of attention, the way she clutched her purse like a lifeline. I see a lot of first dates from my post at the hostess stand, but this one felt different. There was a fragile hope about her, a quiet strength beneath the nerves. She felt real in a city full of pretenders. I led her to a table in the back, away from the prying eyes of the Fifth Avenue crowd, and I remember thinking that whoever she was meeting had better be worth the effort she'd clearly put in. She was a work of art, and for a moment, our dimly lit restaurant felt like her own private gallery. I watched her settle in, her gaze drifting around the room, a small, anxious smile playing on her lips. The guy, Tyler, showed up about 15 minutes late, a classic power move. I hated him on sight. He was handsome, I guess, if you like the kind of guys who look like they stepped out of a catalog, all perfect teeth and feigned sincerity. I watched them from afar as I seated other guests, catching snippets of their performance. It all looked normal enough, the polite smiles, the easy conversation. But I've been doing this job for a long time. You learn to read the undercurrents. And beneath the surface of their perfect first date, something felt wrong. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I saw her glance at her phone once or twice when he wasn't looking, a flicker of something, not boredom but worry in her eyes. I told myself I was imagining things. This was what people did. They met, they dated, they tried to find a connection in the noise. Their little corner of the restaurant was like a bubble, oblivious to the world of casual celebrations and business deals happening around them. To everyone else, they were just another couple. But I kept watching. I saw the shift when it happened. Her shoulders, which had started to relax, tensed up again. His charming smile was still in place, but his posture had changed. He was leaning in, not with intimacy, but with intensity. It was the subtle, predatory angle of a hunter closing in. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. My job was to smile and seat people, to keep the flow of the evening smooth. It wasn't my place to interfere. But a voice in my head, a voice I've ignored too many times, whispered that this was more than just a bad date. This was a trap, and she was walking right into it, blissfully unaware. He said something that made her look down, and that's when he reached for her hand. I saw the way his fingers wrapped around hers, a little too tight, a little too possessive. It wasn't a caress, it was an anchor. My own hands felt clammy. Every instinct screamed at me to go over there, to drop a water glass, to create any kind of distraction that would give her a reason to escape. But I stayed put, paralyzed by the thought of causing a scene, of being wrong. He kept talking, his expressions smooth and calculated. The alarm bells in my head were deafening now. This wasn't a date. It was an interrogation disguised as one. He was asking questions, but they didn't have the light, get to know you feel. They were pointed, deliberate. He was digging for something, and the forced smile on her face told me she was starting to realize it too. Her answer must not have been what he wanted, because I saw his jaw tighten for a fraction of a second. I saw her try to pull her hand back, a subtle, desperate movement. He didn't let go. His thumb made slow circles on her skin, a gesture that should have been comforting, but looked menacing from where I stood. I saw her mouth form a question, her voice too low to hear, but her meaning perfectly clear. The entire friendly facade between them shattered in that one silent exchange. He said her name, or I think he did, and his smile became something sharp and ugly. This is it, I thought. This is the moment you step in. Say something. Do something. But my feet felt like lead. I was just a witness, hidden in plain sight, my silence making me complicit in whatever was about to happen. He held her there, a prisoner at her own table, his eyes hard and calculating. The mask was completely off now. He was no longer a charming suitor. He was a threat. My heart hammered against my ribs. I saw her defiance, the way she lifted her chin, the fire that returned to her eyes even as fear radiated from her. She was a fighter. She was smarter and stronger than he gave her credit for. I could see she understood the game he was playing, and she wasn't going to be a pawn. He was trying to bully her, to intimidate her into submission, and for a terrifying moment, I was afraid it would work. But then I saw that flicker of resolve, that decision to push back, and a surge of admiration cut through my fear. She was cornered, but she wasn't broken. Then, with a sudden sharp movement, she wrenched her hand free. The wine glass tipped, spilling its contents across the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. The crimson stain spread, a stark and violent declaration that the evening was over. The symbolism was so potent it made me catch my breath. He didn't try to stop her when she stood this time. He just watched her with a cold, smug look, as if this was all part of his plan. The fury I felt was suffocating, fury at him for his cruelty, and at myself for my cowardice. I watched her grab her purse, her hands shaking, her composure finally cracking. He had ambushed her, turned a hopeful evening into a nightmare, and I had just stood by and let it happen. I had failed her. She hurried past my stand without a glance, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She burst through the doors and into the night, and I watched her through the glass, a lonely figure in a red dress under the harsh city lights. I saw her lean against the wall, trying to compose herself, trying to process the violation. This was my fault. I could have intervened, I could have created a scene, drawn attention, given her an escape. But I had chosen to be a silent witness, and the weight of that choice settled on my shoulders like a shroud. I saw her pull out her phone, her fingers trembling. I braced myself, expecting her to call a cab, to run as far and as fast as she could, but she didn't run. I watched her scroll through her contacts, her posture shifting from victim to survivor. There was a sudden stillness about her, a terrifying resolve. She made a call, and though I couldn't hear the words, I heard the name she spoke into the phone. It was a name that carried weight in this city, a name associated with power and danger. In that moment, she wasn't calling for a ride. She was calling in an airstrike. She chose to fight. And watching her, I finally found a sliver of my own courage. When the man, Tyler, walked out moments later, I made sure to look him right in the eye. I memorized every detail of his smug face. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that someone would eventually come asking questions. And this time, I wouldn't stay silent. He didn't even look at me as he left. He just moved toward the elevators, his focus absolute. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the file on my desk, the one with Tyler's name on it, the one full of whatever dirt Lorenzo's people had dug up, the ammunition he would use to destroy this man just for daring to take Lily to dinner. In that moment, after months of silence, I finally did something. I picked up the file, walked over to the heavy-duty shredder in the copy room, and fed every single page into its teeth. It wasn't much. It probably wouldn't even stop him. But it was all I could do. I just hoped, as the machine whirred, that it would be enough to give her a chance. A real one. I remember the day it all started, the moment I knew my silence was a mistake. I saw him notice her, truly notice her, on her first day. The way his eyes, usually cold as steel, followed her as she walked to her desk. Just for a second, the mask slipped. I should have warned her then, told her what kind of world this was, what kind of man he was. Then came the whispers about the Monroes trying to move in on the docks. I saw the pressure building in him, but I never connected it to her. Not until I saw them through his office glass, her face ashen and his jaw clenched so tight I thought it would break. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I had watched it all unfold. I couldn't make out the words, but I could read the fury in the set of his shoulders, the desperate restraint. He was all coiled energy, leaning into her space, and she was resisting. It wasn't a boss disciplining an employee. It was something elemental, something possessive and terrifying. I've been his assistant for a decade, and I've never seen him lose that iron control. He saw her as his responsibility, which in our world is a dangerous, gilded cage. A knot of regret formed in my gut. She was so bright, so unaware, and I had just stood by, a silent accomplice to her fate. The argument ended, but the silence that hung between them was deafening. He looked like a man who'd let a terrible secret escape, and she just seemed lost in the wreckage. He was arguing about how she presented herself, about a red dress. From anyone else, it would have been a lawsuit. From Lorenzo Vitali, it was a raw confession, one that painted a bright red target on her back for all his enemies to see. The regret tasted like acid. I should have told her to be less vibrant, less alive. But how do you ask a flame to burn less brightly? I saw them leave together that night, his hand on the small of her back, not a request, but a command. He drove his own car, dismissing his usual driver. That's how I knew it had gone far beyond business. It was deeply personal. As his car disappeared into the river of city lights, a cold fear settled over me. He was taking her to his home, pulling her over a threshold from which there was no easy return. My own apartment felt cavernous that night, my silence echoing off the walls, accusing me of cowardice. Sleep wouldn't come. I kept imagining her in that penthouse of his, a sterile glass box overlooking the city he owned. I'd only ever coordinated maintenance for it, but I knew it was a fortress, built to keep the world out. I wondered, though, if she would see the small things I had noticed over the years. The worn spine of a book in Italian on his side table, the way he would sometimes just stare out the window, looking past his empire to something lost. I prayed she would see the man I occasionally glimpsed beneath the monster. The next morning, you could have cut the tension in the office with a knife. They arrived at different times, but it didn't matter. A charge arced between them, invisible and potent. Something had fundamentally shifted. He looked exhausted, the careful mask of control showing cracks around the edges. I had watched him for months, his gaze secretly following her every move, his voice dropping a half octave when he spoke her name. It was a private, self-inflicted torture, and I knew that kind of obsession was a weakness his rivals would smell like blood in the water. She had no idea she'd become his center of gravity. She'd challenge him in front of his most dangerous men, rolling her eyes at an order like he was just some annoying supervisor. And he would let her. In his eyes, I wouldn't see anger, but a flicker of grudging admiration, something almost tender. She wasn't cowed by the legend, and that fearless quality was precisely what made her so vital to him, and so vulnerable. I saw it all, every stolen glance, every tense exchange, and my silence felt like a betrayal. I remember the day the Martinelli deal went sideways. The office was a tomb, everyone braced for an explosion, but she walked in, put his coffee on his desk, and started outlining a solution with unnerving calm. No fear, no hesitation. That's when I understood. She wasn't just brave, she was his equal in spirit. And in that moment, the look on his face changed for good. He saw her not as an employee, but as his inevitable fate. I should have told her to get out, to run and never look back. But a part of me, a small, hopeful part, wondered if she was the only one who could save him from himself. For weeks, the guilt was a constant companion. It wasn't just about his feelings anymore. It was about her life. I saw a car across the street from our building, one of the Monroe family's enforcers behind the wheel, just sitting there, watching. The old me, the silent me, would have pretended not to see. But I thought of her laugh, the way she made this dark world feel a little less grim. I couldn't do nothing. My hands shook as I walked to the payphone on the block. I called his head of security. I didn't say my name. I just said, Blue Sedan, Bleecker Street, watching the entrance. Then I hung up. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was me finally choosing hope over fear. I remember the first day I truly saw it. It was in the way his hand paused near her face, a gesture so intimate it felt like I was spying. I knew her, Lily Morgan, just a colleague from the next cubicle over. But I realized then that I was seeing him, Lorenzo Vitali, for the first time too. Not as our boss, but as a man obsessed. I'd seen the signs, of course. The way he watched her, the darkness in his eyes when any other guy from accounting would talk to her for too long. He was a storm gathering on her horizon, and I watched it coming, silent and scared for her. I knew the rumors about him, the whispers of danger that clung to his expensive suits. I felt the weight of my silence then, a heavy stone in my gut. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she was a grown woman. But a part of me knew this was more than an office romance. It was a story with a dangerous edge, and I was just a spectator. I'll never forget the Monday after. When she walked in, I knew. There was a change in her, a light, a shadow. When he spoke to her, his voice was rougher, deeper. I saw his eyes darken when she said his name, and the air between them was so thick you could feel it across the room. I saw them in the hallway later, his lips barely a whisper from hers. I ducked back into my cubicle, my heart pounding. It wasn't a gentle thing I saw in his eyes. It was a hunger. It was 6 months of watching her, wanting her, finally breaking its leash. I saw her hands fist the fabric of his expensive shirt, and I knew she was being pulled under. She was drowning in him, in the promise of something thrilling and terrifying. My own inaction felt like a betrayal. I watched him trace the line of her back, a possessive, dangerous touch. And I just sat there, pretending to file papers. My silence, my complicity. His voice, a low murmur against her skin, was something I could only imagine. But I saw the result the next day, the faint mark on her neck she tried to hide with a scarf. The cool air of the office must have felt like a shock after the heat I imagined between them. I saw him watching her from his office, his gaze so intense it was practically a touch. She looked both fragile and unbreakable in that moment, a paradox he had created. I saw the way he looked at her and knew it wasn't just physical. He saw her as something beautiful and precious, something that hurt him to want so badly. I watched her reach for him in small ways, a shared glance, a soft smile. I saw the scars on his knuckles one day and thought about the violent life she was now a part of. He was danger, and she was walking right into it, and I said nothing. My silence was a wall I was building around myself, shutting out the responsibility to a friend. I imagined her wrapping her life around his, pulling him closer to a world he probably wanted to escape. I heard the rumors, the whispers of his barely controlled temper, and I worried. I wanted to tell her to stop, to walk away, to get back to her simple life of dating boring stockbrokers. But when I saw them together, the possessiveness in his eyes was matched by the certainty in hers. He had claimed her, and maybe the most terrifying part was that she wanted to be claimed. She was his, and I was just the coworker who saw it all happen. My silence felt like a disease, growing with every passing day, with every stolen glance I witnessed between them. I was a ghost in their story, haunting the edges, filled with a regret that was becoming a part of me. What happened next was inevitable, a crash I saw coming from miles away. After that, everything was different. We'd be tangled in spreadsheets, and I'd look up and see him just watching her from his office. The city outside glittered, but her world had shrunk to the size of his protection. His security detail became a fixture in our lobby, big men in dark suits. She stopped taking the subway. She stopped staying out late with the rest of us for drinks. She was in his gilded cage, and I wondered if she even knew the door was locked. His arms were a fortress, but every fortress is also a prison. I should have asked if she was okay. I should have insisted we get coffee, just the two of us. But his world was seeping into ours, and I was afraid of what stepping into it might mean. So I stayed quiet, and our friendship became another casualty of their romance. I kept my head down, pretending not to notice how he'd find excuses to call her into his office. Once, the door was ajar, and I heard him call her tesoro. The word was soft, a treasure discovered in the middle of our sterile corporate world. He was a lot of things, our boss, but professional wasn't one of them anymore, not with her. That Italian endearment was a glimpse of the man beneath the monster, and it only made my guilt worse. How could I judge a love that sounded so much like worship? I saw him press a kiss to her hair one afternoon when he thought no one was looking. But I was looking. I was always looking. I saw the shadow of the Monroe deal hanging over them, a chill that even their heat couldn't completely burn away. His world worked on consequences, and I was terrified she would be the one to pay the price. My silence was my sin. The day she drifted into the office, looking like she'd woken up in his bed, was the day I knew there was no going back. She wasn't just Lily from marketing anymore. The bed was his, the sheets were his, the view was from his penthouse. I saw a note clutched in her hand, his elegant script visible even from my desk. He was a boss, even in love. It was almost funny. She was wearing one of his shirts under her blazer, the white cuffs peeking out. It was an intimate, blatant claim. I saw her catch her reflection in the darkened window of the conference room. She looked lost, happy, and completely, utterly terrified. As she walked back to her desk, her gaze met mine for a fleeting second. In her eyes, I saw a plea, a question, and I looked away. I turned back to my monitor, and the weight of that single cowardly moment settled in my soul for good. I was pouring a coffee when I saw her staring at her phone, her face ashen. I didn't have to read the messages to know they were from him, from Tyler. I saw the fear ripple through her, the way her hand trembled. This was it. This was the dark side, the consequences Lorenzo had brought into her life. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted around the office and landed on me. She was looking for an anchor, for someone to say something, anything. And I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The moment passed. Lorenzo strode through the door, his presence a thundercloud, and her attention snapped to him. The opportunity was gone. I had failed her. I had seen her terror and chosen my own safety, my own comfortable silence. That choice has replayed in my mind 1,000 times since, a constant reminder of my own weakness. It all started with a look. I remember seeing him watch her across the office months ago, not like a boss, but like a predator. I should have seen it for what it was. That morning, when Marco called, his voice clipped, telling me to pack a bag for her, my stomach sank. He said there was an incident, that she'd be staying with Mr. Vitali. I knew then that my silence had already made me an accomplice. The way he looked at her that first day wasn't admiration, it was acquisition. A darkness swirled in his eyes, a promise of ownership I chose to ignore. Now, I was being sent to collect her life in a suitcase, sealing a deal I had witnessed being made in 100 silent, possessive glances. I felt the guilt even then, a cold stone in my gut. That look of his should have been my first warning. Instead, I just told myself it was none of my business. Then came Tyler Monroe's frantic calls, and I saw the first flicker of real fear in Lily's eyes, a fear I pretended not to notice. Getting the order to pack her things felt like a judgment. I stood in her small, quiet apartment, folding her clothes, my hands shaking. The sight of her torn dress, carelessly tossed over a chair, told a story I didn't want to read. I felt a wave of shame for not having said something, anything, before it came to this. Packing her life into 2 suitcases felt like closing a cage door, and I was the one turning the key. My silence was a betrayal I'd have to live with forever. His mother was a legend in the company, a ghost of strength and savvy business sense. I remember hearing the old-timers talk about her. They said she was a force of nature, the velvet glove over his father's iron fist. When I brought the suitcases over, I saw Lily standing there in his kitchen, looking so small in that vast, cold space. She wasn't like the other women he'd entertained, all polished ice and hard ambition. Lily was warm and stubborn and real. I saw the ghost of his mother in his eyes as he watched her, a mix of longing and respect. But I also saw the trap closing around her, and my heart ached with the words I never had the courage to speak. I've seen how he operates. He doesn't offer help, he creates dependence. He calls it protection, but it's a beautiful gilded cage. Every day I watched him from my desk, observing how he maneuvered people, how he anticipated every move. I knew he saw Lily as his most prized possession, and the thought terrified me for her. He would offer her the world, a safe harbor from men like Tyler Monroe, but it would come at a cost. Her freedom, her choices. I saw it all unfolding, and my fear for my own job kept my mouth shut. My quiet compliance felt like a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off, a silent endorsement of the danger she was walking into. The thought of her leaving, of escaping him, should have felt like a relief, but a selfish part of me knew the office would be darker without her light. After she moved in with him, the shift was immediate. The discreet security, the way conversations would halt when she entered a room, it was suffocating. She was his now, and everyone knew it. He'd given her a choice between a life on the run or a life with him, and called it a fair offer. I saw the strain behind her smile, the weight of the guards and the constant scrutiny. She was learning the rules of his world, and I was just a silent spectator, watching her trade her independence for a phantom of safety. First, she demanded to keep her job. I overheard them one morning, her voice low but firm. She told him she was nobody's property. A spark of hope ignited in me. Then she insisted he be honest, that she wouldn't be kept in the dark. She was negotiating the terms of her gilded cage, and I felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just surviving him, She was challenging him. She fought for every inch of her freedom, refusing to be a passive player in her own life. That small act of defiance gave me courage. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter. It made my silence feel even more cowardly, but it also planted a seed of an idea, a way I could finally do something right. When the Monroe situation blew up, I saw the change in him. The mask of the charming CEO fell away, and the cold, ruthless boss was all that remained. I heard him on the phone with Marco, his voice like ice, talking about war and making examples. The air in the office crackled with tension. He was going to a meeting that night, not to negotiate, but to annihilate. Looking at Lily, who stood by him with a steady gaze, I realized she saw the monster and wasn't running. She was choosing to stand in the heart of the storm. It was a terrifying choice, a choice I would never make, but I suddenly understood that my role wasn't to save her, but to support her strength. I smiled when I delivered her things, a hollow gesture that hid the knot in my stomach. She looked so out of place, yet so right, standing there in his home. He followed her as she took her bags, his eyes never leaving her, a dark hunger in his gaze that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just offering her a room, he was claiming her whole world, her days and her nights. He wanted her in his bed, in his arms, a constant presence to soothe the darkness inside him. I saw her hesitate, then agree. In her surrender, I saw a strange kind of power, an acceptance that undid me. I left that day feeling more conflicted than ever, a witness to a beautiful, terrifying conquest. I try not to remember that first day, but it always comes back to me. The boss, Lorenzo, wasn't himself. He had this cold focus, the kind he gets before things get messy. We were supposed to meet with Vincent Monroe, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But then she stood up to him. Lily. She said she wanted to come, that she deserved to be there. I've never seen anyone talk back to him like that, not without consequences. He just looked at her, and for a second, the killer in his eyes was gone. He agreed. That's when the guilt started twisting in my gut. She had no idea what she was walking into, and my job was to stand by and watch it happen. We got to Salvatore's an hour later. The place was on lockdown. My guys were everywhere. I was supposed to be watching the doors, but my eyes kept drifting to her. When Monroe showed up, he looked at her like she was something to be bought, not a person. Old, with eyes like a shark. Lorenzo put his hand on her back, and it was as much a warning to Monroe as it was a comfort to her. My hand was on my piece the whole time, a cold weight in my jacket. I was a silent witness, a part of the machine that brought this good woman into a room with monsters, and I hated myself for it. I was too far to hear it all, but I saw how Lorenzo leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. I saw Monroe's men get twitchy. We moved in, just a little, a silent promise of violence. It's a dance I know well, but with her there, it felt wrong. Every second stretched into an eternity, and I just kept thinking that if things went bad, she would be caught in the middle. My silence was part of my job, but that night it felt like a betrayal. I was protecting the boss, but who was protecting her from our world? From us? That question has haunted me ever since. Then Monroe made his mistake. He called her a weakness. I saw the change in the boss. It was like a switch flipped. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. One word from Lorenzo, and the place would have been filled with smoke and blood. I was ready to do my part. But he held back. For her. He chose her safety over his pride, trading threats instead of bullets. He was fighting for her, using the only language men like Monroe understood. I stood there, a statue with a gun, complicit in a world that was about to swallow her whole. When Monroe and his goons finally left, you could feel the air leave the room. But Lorenzo, he didn't relax. He just turned to her, and all that ice in his eyes melted. He touched her face so gently, you'd think she was made of glass. I looked away, tried to give them a moment. It felt like I was intruding on something private, something pure that didn't belong in a place like this. Driving them home, watching them in the rearview mirror, I knew nothing would ever be the same for him. He'd found something he wasn't willing to lose. In the months that followed, I saw the change in him. He still ran the empire, but there was a new light in him. He'd talk about legitimizing the businesses, about a future. He'd talk about it like it was a real possibility. I'd been with him for years, through some of the darkest times, but I'd never seen him hope before. She gave him that. And maybe, just maybe, it gave me a little hope too. That maybe we weren't all doomed to end up in a ditch or a prison cell. That a different life was possible. The ride back to the penthouse that night was quiet but loaded. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel the energy coming from the back seat. My job is to see everything without being seen, to be a ghost who protects the king. After that night, she was always there. He didn't just take her to bed, he took her into his world. I'd drive them to meetings, and I'd see him listen to her, really listen. She wasn't just the boss's girl anymore. She was becoming his queen. It started the day I saw Vincent Monroe leaving the office. I felt the change in the air, the way Mr. Vitale stood perfectly still. A war was coming. You could see it on his face. So much loss. His expression was a vow. I knew he was making a hard promise, one that would cost blood. He glanced at Lily's desk, and his whole purpose was clear. He would weigh the cost of a fight against keeping her safe, and the choice was already made. He'd protect what he considered his, whatever it took. I saw him watching her. His gaze was so intense. I should have told her then, warned her about the violence, that there are things in this life you can never unsee. Was she strong enough for all that? I'd seen the Monroe's men before, the way they treated people like pawns on a board. Mr. Vitale was dangerous, but he was direct about it. To him, she wasn't just a tool. I'm sure of that. I should have said something. But I stayed quiet. Then I heard her ask him for a promise, anything, he'd said. I hoped she could keep him from being consumed by the violence, the power, the endless need for control. Keep him from vanishing into it, so that the man she saw was still there. I saw something in his eyes once when he looked at her. Surprise, maybe? As if he couldn't believe she'd seen past the monster to the man. I noticed the way she'd touch his face, her hand on his jaw. That was the most dangerous move of all, I thought. The most reckless thing she could do. He even smiled, like he knew it too. And I saw in that look he would try to stay himself for her. He would try to remember a world outside of strategy and war. That was her only request. I started seeing them arrive together in the mornings, the city lights still on. To her, he had become home. Not a place, but a person. It became their rhythm. Coffee first, then work. They'd come into the office together, Marco driving as they went over the day's business. At the office, they kept a formal distance, but I saw him watching her with a fire in his eyes that promised something for later. It should have been uncomfortable, the change from boss and assistant to whatever they were. But it wasn't. Their conversations had a new energy. Every accidental touch seemed to mean something more. When they were alone in his office, the quiet that followed was deafening. "We're not very good at this," I heard her say one afternoon as she walked past my desk, fixing her shirt. "I don't care," his voice came from the office. He sounded pleased. "Let them talk. Let them know you belong to me." He was so possessive, and she enjoyed it. I couldn't say I blamed her. An entire week went by in that peaceful bubble. No more shadows from the Monroes. No more late-night tension. Just work. And then, her life with him. I let myself think it might actually work out. That something good could grow in his dark world. Then the quiet broke. I was at my desk, organizing papers when Marco blew past me without a word. His face was a mask of dread. "Boss, we have a situation." Mr. Vitale looked up from his computer. "What kind of situation?" "Vincent Monroe is dead, shot at his home 2 hours ago." I saw Marco's eyes cut toward Lily. "And rumors are flying that we gave the order." The blood drained from Mr. Vitale's face. What? It couldn't have been us, right? I heard her ask. But she knew. He had been with her all night and all morning. There was no chance. Of course it wasn't. Mr. Vitale was already up, grabbing his phone. But we're being framed. Marco, call the lawyers and find out who's pushing this story. There is more, Marco said, his voice heavy. Tyler Monroe is calling for blood. He's rallying support, telling everyone you broke the truce and killed his father. Mr. Vitale's jaw set like stone. He's using it as an excuse to start the war we just stopped. Or someone else killed Vincent to force a war, Lily said, putting a voice to my own terror. Who wins when you and the Monroes destroy each other? Any number of other families. Mr. Vitale pushed a hand through his hair, a rare crack in his composure, and every single one would love to watch us burn. What are we going to do? She asked. He looked at her, and for a second, I saw pure fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her. We get ready for war. The next 72 hours were a tense, frantic haze. He sent Lily to a safe house, a fortress in a building he owned with armed men at every door. I knew she'd hate being trapped, but I understood it. If Tyler Monroe wanted his revenge, she'd be his first move. Mr. Vitale never stopped moving, always with guards, and looking more exhausted every time I saw him. The pressure of running this crisis and keeping her alive was wearing him down. I imagined her telling him to eat, that he couldn't win if he collapsed. I'll eat when this is done, I could almost hear him say, but he'd take a bite, just to make her happy. I heard them say they were close to finding who really killed Vincent. Once they had proof, they could show the other families they were being played, and if Tyler didn't listen to reason, if he just wanted his fight, then Mr. Vitale would give him what he wanted. His expression was cold steel, on his terms, not Tyler's. 3 days after Vincent's death, they found it. Marco had tracked down the hitman who was hired by the Russo family, a smaller rival. They had killed Vincent and set it up to look like us, hoping to start a war that would get rid of both of us. The evidence was solid. Call logs, money trails, people willing to talk. Mr. Vitale called a meeting of the main families, presenting the proof with Marco and the lawyers at his side. I pictured Lily watching on a video feed somewhere, terrified. Tyler Monroe's face was unreadable the whole time. When Mr. Vitale was done, Tyler stood up. Even if you're right, it doesn't matter. My father is gone. Your world is why. Someone has to answer for it. Then let it be the Russos, Mr. Vitale said, coolly. They took your father's life and tried to pin it on me. They used you to call for my death. Are you really going to let them get away with that? The other bosses started talking among themselves, convinced by what they'd seen. Tyler's support was dissolving. They knew that to keep backing him would make them look like fools, or worse, like they were in on it. Finally, Tyler sank into his chair. Fine, we handle the Russos. But it's not finished, Vitale. My family has a long memory. So does mine, Mr. Vitale answered evenly. Remember that. The meeting broke up, and I felt the entire building exhale in relief. It wasn't over. Tyler was still a problem. The Russos would face justice. But the all-out war had been stopped. Mr. Vitale was safe. I imagined him going to the safe house that night, looking tired but relieved. I saw her meeting him at the door, just holding him without a word. The two of them just standing there, letting the crisis wash away. It's over, he'd murmur into her hair. You can come home. This was never about a place, Lorenzo. I'm home with you. I could see him pull back to look at her, his eyes full of emotion. How did I ever find you? I imagined him asking. I bet she asked herself the same thing. I could almost hear her teasing him, saying it was probably his coffee-making skills. He would have laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in days. That must be it. They went back to his apartment that night, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I could breathe again. The danger had passed. They had survived. But I had seen the teeth of Mr. Vitale's world. and I knew the next fight was never far away. A month passed. Things settled. She was back at her desk, but everyone knew she was with him now. Some of his men treated her with a new respect, others with a barely hidden scorn. She didn't seem to care. She had him. She had her work. She had a life that mattered, even with the risks. I watched them in his office one afternoon when my own silent decision had finally taken root. I want to learn. I overheard her. Mr. Vitale looked up from his desk. Learn what? Your world. How it all works. Who is who. What the unspoken rules are. She stood right beside his desk. If I am going to be a part of your life, I need to see the entire board. I have to anticipate the plays. He just looked at her for a long time. It isn't too late to leave, you know. To go have a normal life. I am choosing you. That is my normal. Her gaze never wavered. Teach me. And he did. In the months that followed, I watched as he taught her the intricate politics of his world. She learned which families were allies, which were enemies, and which were just waiting for a chance to move. She learned to read the silences in meetings, to feel the weight of a look or a gesture. It was a new language, where not speaking was a statement, and respect was a currency more valuable than cash. He was patient with her, always taking her questions seriously, and bit by bit, I saw she was no longer just the girlfriend he had to protect. That night, I pulled an old invoice from the files, the Russo invoice. I typed a short, anonymous note about it and slid it under Marco's door. It was a tiny act, a whisper of courage, but it wasn't silence. And that was a start. She had a sharp mind, and he saw it. He started trusting her instincts, asking for her take on things. It was strange, watching him let someone else in like that. He was building a partnership. I'd hear him on the phone, talking about reducing the violence, about making things cleaner. He was changing the entire game, and it was because of her. He wanted to build something that wouldn't get her killed, something that could last. He was building it for her, with her. Then came the night at Richie's. 6 months later. He had us clear the whole restaurant, just for them. It was my job to stand guard, to watch his back. But when he got down on one knee, I knew my real job was different. I took a few steps back, melting into the shadows by the service door, and I turned my gaze outward, to the street. It was a small thing, a tiny act of defiance against my duties, but I gave them that moment, that small piece of privacy. It was my silent prayer, my contribution to their chance at a life, hoping they could build something clean in a world of dirt. The engagement announcement felt like a final breath held too long. The ring on her finger was stunning, a diamond fortress. He promised her partnership, loyalty, a future built together. It was a beautiful speech, full of love and devotion, but I knew his love was a complicated, dangerous thing. So that evening, I did the one small thing I could. I left a file on her new desk, the original incorporation papers for a small textile import business, his mother's first solo venture. It was a piece of his world she could truly own, a thread of independence she could weave into her future. It was my silent apology, my quiet prayer that she would not just be his queen, but an empress in her own right. Their wedding felt like a merger of two kingdoms, the legitimate and the lethal. I stood in the back, a ghost from her old life, watching my friend step into her new one. Her father looked bewildered. Her mother wept. But when Lorenzo took her hands, his voice thick with emotion as he made his vows, I saw none of the danger. I saw only a man who had found his salvation. Their first dance was a thing of beauty, him whispering in her ear as he held her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling into darkness. It was later, at the reception, that I saw my chance. I saw Tyler Monroe's cousin, drunk and bragging to some of his friends about how the family wasn't done with Lily yet. This time, I didn't look away. I walked to the bar, scribbled his words on a cocktail napkin, and found the imposing man I knew was Lorenzo's head of security. I pressed it into his hand without a word and walked away, melting back into the crowd, my heart finally, mercifully, a little lighter. I remember the night she wore that red dress like it was yesterday. From my desk, I saw the storm gathering in his eyes as he asked her something, his gaze locked on hers. She turned to him, the man who I once thought was just dangerous, a predator watching his prey, but who she somehow saw differently. I hear her make a joke about the dress, and the sound is so light, so free, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension I felt from him that night. He pulls her close, his grip possessive, and I remember how he stood like a statue, watching her walk out of my lobby, his fury a silent, terrifying thing. I should have said something, anything, but I just polished the brass and stayed quiet. Now, he kisses her right there for everyone to see, a public claim. His voice from 6 months ago echoes in my head. "Where are you going?" A demand, not a question, that had chilled me to the bone. As they approach my desk to leave, I pull the small silk scarf from my drawer, the one she dropped that frantic night. "You left this," I say, handing it to her. "Glad to see you finally made it home." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.